And again, when you ask those questions themselves come from a different analysis. Does that make sense to you? That's not our task, in my opinion. Our task is to be witness to the story. That's not the point. If that's not your experience, then for you to be willing to listen to what's not being said, to the larger story, to the way that you relate, and then to share with this person what it is that you're experiencing. And then you figure out behaviorally or relationally what's going to work for both of you and the support group. And I think that's process and time for all of us. It was not easy to begin to tell a new story, right? Did any of us get stuck in an old story? Anybody ever get stuck there? Let's just own it. We all did. And it does take time, and it takes a lot of trust and relationship to work on that. It also takes proactivity. I absolutely believe that there is an intention to peer support. And the first step in that intention is helping each other unlearn how we've come to know what we know. If that doesn't exist, we're in trouble. The second way that this makes sense to me is that we then no longer have to think about feelings as symptoms. Now, just to throw out the question, what is different between a big feeling and a symptom? What's different in terms of your experience? Yeah.
Everybody has feelings, but not everybody has symptoms. If you have symptoms, you're sick.
Okay. Anybody else? Yep.
Nothing.
Okay. All over the map here. Anybody else? And so we'll play with that throughout the course of the next couple of days, because if we are in fact going to talk from a non-medical analysis, we can no longer talk really in the language of symptoms because it doesn't fit any longer. And Pat, the other response I wanted to say is the proactivity, the teaching part, for me has worked quite well with people who default to old ways of being and knowing. If you have a mindset or a mental picture of, and you can step back from yourself when you're not in the thick of it, then it's harder and harder to just say, I can't, or this just happens to me. If you don't have an environment that assumes this thing is happening to me, and you develop an environment of critical self-reflection, or, there's a million words for it, but of consciousness raising. It brings us back to the very topic of how do we redefine help so that it's not I'm there to help you, or assume that you have problems that you need support around. It's about changing help so that it's a relational phenomenon where both people are willing to invest in each other. There's something missing in all of this. We talk about peer support, we talk about it going both ways, we talk about mutual responsibility and all of that stuff. And one of the problems that just has been created in a treatment model is that people don't give back. People don't feel valuable. People don't feel like they can be helpful to you. and we're going to talk about this more role contextually, because that always comes up when you're paid. Is it responsible and ethical to get help from the other person? And I think, in fact, if we don't change that dynamic, if we don't make sure that help goes both ways, if we don't challenge each other, if we're not focused on both of our growth as opposed to me helping you, nothing changes, because I stay, no matter what it is that you do towards my recovery, I stay in that devalued role of recipient. I think this is one of the more critical, elusive, yet important concepts that we've got to talk about. This is where it gets political, because we actually have something called peer support. We have a group of people who've been tremendously disenfranchised, been told a lot of stuff, and we have the opportunity to grow this thing. It's not just about mental health. I mean, clearly this is about, changes in the way that we see and know and everything else. But I think we have this opportunity to do something unique and distinct in the name of peer support, really working at it, growing it here, finding language that really fits for us, finding strategies and principles that really fit with our values, and just beginning to use that structure and that forum to move a larger agenda ahead. There's an intention behind peer support in the way that we're talking about. There's an intention that doesn't just exist with friends. I mean, it is different than just, casual conversations that you're not really intentional about. And what I think we can use politically is to say, people need a place, a structure, an environment, a community where they can feel comfortable enough to step back from how they know what they know and challenge it. We're the tank where all the unlearning happens. And then, so you defend that in the sense that, then we can move towards what we want. I think everything is a factor. I think that's the point. It's not that they're not. It's that, we have to consider that as opposed to that narrower view of the medical perspective. And in response to, do we need to be teaching professionals? I mean, I think we as a community need to establish what it is that we're doing. I've been saying this for years. I don't think we're clear about what our task is. Once we establish our task and really define it and set some standards, if you will, then we can teach it to them so that they can better support it. That's kind of my take on stuff. Whether they do it or not, frankly, I have less interest in changing the dominant system and much more interest in creating an alternative system. Because I think we have to have something really separate to begin to do, to make those changes, and then we learn from each other, as we both grow. And so the whole premise of this is to think contextually. How did somebody come to know what they know? What is their background? What is their culture? What is their race? What is their economic level? What is their trauma history? It's listening more broadly and really deeply trying to understand how that person sees and knows the world. And there's a commitment to that kind of listening. And the other thing that the trauma-informed does, and I won't belabor this forever, but is it totally allows us to look at the context and do something about that, as opposed to reacting to it, reacting to the effects of it. And I think that's what drew me to the trauma-informed framework to begin with. And I think that's what we need to be focusing on, is social change. I think in most peer programs, peer relationships, peer groups, whatever the structure is, things can go along really nicely and smoothly when everybody's feeling good about each other and everybody's sort of getting along. But something happens where we're uncomfortable and we start to treat discomfort as a problem as opposed to as a learning opportunity. And I think that's really interesting because it brings us back to then doing assessment and evaluation. Does that make sense to you? What I've seen over and over and over and over again on multiple levels, and this is the systems kind of thinking, is that in our personhood, we don't deal with conflict very well. In relationships, one-on-one, we don't deal with conflict very well. And then in larger systems, we don't deal with conflict very well. And in the peer dynamics, a lot of what gets reenacted is the stuff that people came with that's contextual. Much conflict drives people into old roles. You ever notice how when a conflict emerges in your program or your support group, that somebody's always kind of invisible and leaves, that there's always somebody who's kind of aggressive, there's always somebody who's kind of the scapegoat or the peacemaker or any of those roles? Do you ever notice that? And it's interesting. I mean, it's not surprising that we would fall into roles that are familiar to us in those situations. But we don't talk about it. And all we do is try to manage it, just like we try to manage symptoms. So we ask people to leave. We set up more rules. We have more policies. We have more control. So I like to think about this topic as fear, power, and control, and deconstructing that. Because it's when we get uncomfortable that we sort of take our position of power, whatever that is, and these are all power positions, and we try to add more controls to it. Any of your programs start out with very few rules, and the rules have added on and added on and added on? I can remember at one point in our program early on, I came in and there were signs all over. Wash your hands, do not smoke, do your dishes. And there were rule after rule because people wouldn't deal with these issues. Go ahead, Pat. And if we had tons and tons of time, it would be really interesting, I think, and you guys can do this exercise in your programs, to start writing a list of all of the power positions that exist within your agency. Disconnecting and disappearing is a very powerful position because nobody knows where you are. And we don't talk about that stuff enough. So we use our power when we're uncomfortable, when we're feeling powerless, when something pushes our buttons, when somebody talks about suicide, those kinds of things. And what I'd like to begin to talk about this afternoon is very intentionally, as we've been talking about all day, creating different conversations around just this kind of thing. What do you notice in your programs when somebody mentions the issue of suicide? What do you notice happens? Does everybody run for cover? Do we call the police still? Sometimes. Do we call people's case managers sometimes? Yes, no? What do you guys do? How is suicide, the conversation around suicide dealt with in your programs? What are some of the other things that come up that have made people uncomfortable enough to get into power roles and wanting to control? What are some of the scenarios that have come up for you guys?